Violet and Co. Exam question. Audit Areas 1. Written representation. Twin representations are statements provided by management to confirm specific matters or support other audit evidence. Purpose: confirm management's responsibilities, for example, preparation of financial statements, completeness of information, address areas where evidence is limited, for example, management's assumptions about going concern. 2. Audit evidence and procedures. Audit evidence must be sufficient and appropriate to support audit conclusions. Examples of procedures: inspection, review invoices, contracts, and physical assets. 3. Going concern. Auditors must assess whether the entity can continue as a going concern for at least 12 months. Key risks: recurring losses, liquidity issues, or breached loan covenants. Uncertainty about securing future funding. 4. The audit report. The audit report summarizes the auditor's findings and communicates the opinion. Types of opinions: unmodified, no material misstatements or issues identified; modified, qualified, material misstatements or limitations in specific areas; adverse, financial statements are materially misstated and misleading; disclaimer: insufficient evidence prevents forming an opinion. When discussing evidence, use specific examples and link to financial statement assertions. Ongoing concern: focus on risks, procedures, and reporting impacts. For audit reports, clearly explain modifications and their triggers. We are going to look at a question from the December 2012 exam called Violet & Co. This is question 5 in the exam and covers the following syllabus areas: written representations, audit evidence and procedures, going concern, and the audit report. This question is for 20 marks. With 1.8 minutes allocated per mark, no more than 36 minutes should be spent completing this. To be successful in this question, we must ensure we plan our answer carefully, being careful of the time allocation, use the scenario, and have clear and efficient communication. It may be worth pausing this video and printing the exam question off at this point. You can then follow the questions and the scenario as we talk through it. The format of this question helps us plan our approach. We can see the first requirement, part A, is above the scenario. This has no relation to the information below and is therefore to be attempted using knowledge from your studies. The next requirement, part B, has a small piece of background information to absorb, and again is a standalone section of the question with no relation to the larger scenario below it. The final requirement, part C, is below the larger scenario, and therefore guides you to use the scenario to complete. Please note it is useful to read the requirements before reading a detailed scenario. When it's time to read the scenario, we will have a better idea of what we're looking for, and this will help with time management in the exam. Let's now plan our approach to this question and look at what we need to know for each requirement. Part A asks us to explain the purpose of and procedures for obtaining written representations. This is a knowledge question from the completion and review area of your syllabus. It is for 5 marks, and therefore you should spend no more than 9 minutes explaining 5 things auditors use written representations for in their audit and how they obtain this information. Part B asks us to describe the relevance and reliability of an oral representation as a source of evidence to confirm the completeness of the bank overdraft balance. This requires you to think about the sources of evidence that should be available and whether oral representations are the most appropriate evidence here. This is a 3-mark question. Therefore, 3 things to help decide whether an oral representation is relevant and reliable. No more than about 5 minutes should be spent here. Part C requires your knowledge on materiality, audit procedures, and the audit report. This is a typical completion and review question, giving you a scenario regarding issues found by the auditor during the audit process. You are required to apply your knowledge from your studies to decide what needs to be done for the two clients they have given you in the scenario. The requirement is split into 3 parts. The marks are split between each of the two clients equally. So for this 12-mark question, 6 marks are allocated to Daisy Designs and 6 marks to Fuchsia Enterprises. For part 1, they want you to discuss each issue and assess whether the problems are even material matters. For part 2, they want you to recommend procedures to be completed on these issues, to try and resolve them with the client. And for part 3, they want you to describe the impact on the audit report if the issues are not resolved. This requires you to apply your knowledge and decide the type of audit report and opinion that would be issued by the auditor. Part 3 as a whole is 12 marks, and therefore 22 minutes should be spent completing it. The requirement states that the mark will be split equally between each client issue, and so ensure you spend about 11 minutes each for Daisy and Fuchsia. Let's start with the first requirement, Part A. It asks us to explain the purpose of and procedures for obtaining written representations. Be careful of the requirement. It is asking for 2 things, purpose and procedures. To gain 5 marks, you will need to answer both. The purpose of an audit is to gather sufficient and appropriate evidence that will help the auditor form an independent opinion on the financial statements. Written representations are written confirmation from the directors to the auditors of certain matters. They are a form of audit evidence needed to form an opinion. The auditing standards followed during the audit process tell auditors they must obtain written representations from management to confirm they have prepared the financial statements in accordance with relevant laws and regulations, and provided all relevant information and explanations needed by the auditor. The acceptance of responsibilities in writing is required by ISA 580 written representations. ISA 580 also explains that written representations can be used to gather evidence where there has not been enough for the auditor to feel satisfied. This then acts as a backup to other evidence to ensure everything collected by the auditor is sufficient and appropriate. And so, explaining that written reps are evidence, that they are required by the auditing standards to accept responsibilities, and that they can be used as backup evidence on certain matters, will give you 3 marks. The procedures to obtain written representations can be explained for the remaining 2 marks. I would explain that written representations are gathered by the auditor. During the audit process, the auditor will note any issues where representations are needed, and prepare a draft letter detailing all of the issues that must be confirmed by the management of the client. As a final point, I would state that the client management then prepares this on their headed paper and signs and dates the representation at the end of the audit when the audit report is signed. There are other details you can include, and ACCA's suggested answer has plenty. If comfortable in this area, you could easily write more. But please remember, this question is for 5 marks. You have 7 minutes, so use your time wisely. Part B asks us to describe the relevance and reliability of this oral representation as a source of evidence to confirm the completeness of the bank overdraft balances. This relates directly to the short 1-sentence scenario above it, where they have said that the directors of a company wish to orally confirm the completeness of overdraft balances in liabilities. This is for 3 marks. Again, the risk of spending lots of time answering this is high, and discipline is needed in sticking to the requirements and sticking to 3 things. The requirement wishes us to describe the relevance and reliability of this type of evidence. Therefore, make sure you answer discussing both of these. The relevance of this evidence requires us to think about what the objective of the evidence would be. When we're gathering evidence and performing substantive audit procedures, we must always ensure the procedure and the evidence we obtain from it has an objective. Auditors are given the financial statement assertions as objectives when gathering evidence. Remember, the financial statement assertions are as follows: completeness, occurrence, accuracy, cutoff, classification, existence, rights and obligations, and finally, valuation and allocation. To confirm orally whether the bank overdraft balances are included in liabilities does achieve the assertion completeness, and therefore it is a relevant piece of evidence. The reliability of this evidence is questionable. Auditors must collect evidence from the most dependable sources possible. They only rely on confirmations from directors when all of the sources have been exhausted. Wherever possible, the auditor would gather evidence that is written and in its original form. This oral representation does not fit this criteria. Wherever possible, the auditor will also try and gather evidence from a third party, as this is more reliable than information from the directors. The auditors can obtain confirmation from the bank directly in the form of a bank report, which will list all balances held at the year-end. In conclusion, oral representation from the directors is not the most reliable piece of evidence. To summarize, the 3 marks could be awarded for saying, oral representation is relevant as it does achieve the assertion of completeness. Reliable evidence would preferably be written, and this is oral evidence. Evidence from a third party could be obtained, which would be more reliable than that from the directors. Now onto our final requirement and the detailed scenario. For Part C, we must for both audit clients in the scenario. Part 1, discuss the issue and whether it is material. Part 2, recommend procedures the audit team should undertake at the completion stage and try to resolve the issue. And Part 3, describe the impact on the audit report of the issue if it remains unresolved. If you're struggling to identify the problem and the right course of action, this would suggest a lack of preparation in this area. This type of question requires you to understand the correct accounting treatment, as well as the audit work that should be completed when problems arise. It also requires you to be aware of the different ways the audit report opinion will change if there's a problem that has not been resolved by the auditor and the client. If this is the case, then read over your study notes again in these areas before coming back and trying the question again. If you're ready, let's look at each client in isolation and remember 6 marks for each client. With Daisy Designs, the scenario tells us the sales ledger is corrupted and cannot be accessed. This leaves them with little evidence to obtain to prove the receivables balance and revenue balance. For Part 1, this issue is that the auditors cannot confirm 2 large balances in the financial statements, revenue and receivables. Remember, when calculating materiality, we often use the following benchmarks: 5 to 10% of profit, 0.5 to 1% of revenue, and 1 to 2% of total assets. If we calculate the materiality of the balances using profit, we can see that revenue is nearly 8 times bigger, and receivables is 170% of profit also. This is a very material issue. For Part 2, we need to recommend procedures the audit team should carry out at the completion stage to resolve the issue with the missing evidence. We have already been told in this scenario that there are no backups, and therefore it seems unlikely we can gather alternative evidence. However, a mark would be awarded for stating that you would discuss with management if there are any other sources that may be available to gather evidence on these balances. Alternative audit procedures could be used to help prove the balances to be reasonable. An example is analytical procedures. The auditors could compare both balances monthly to the previous year, and this would identify if balances look unusual. For part 3, we turn to the effect this has on the audit report. This requires our knowledge on audit reports to be applied to the scenario. At the final stage of the audit, they must conclude whether the financial statements are true and fair, based on everything they've obtained. If the auditor believes the financial statements are true and fair, they would issue what we call an unmodified audit report with an unqualified opinion. The problem we have with this client is that if they cannot collect enough evidence, they cannot be sure the financial statements are true and fair. If the auditor does not think the financial statements are true and fair, it is either because there is a material misstatement, or there is not enough sufficient appropriate evidence. In this case, Daisy has a corrupted sales ledger, which leaves the auditor without sufficient appropriate evidence on both revenue and receivables. Therefore, in this case, the auditor issues a modified audit report. The next step is to consider the wording of the audit report in the opinion section. As we've discussed, this is a very material problem. In this situation, it's not just material. 8 times bigger and 170% of profit is huge. We would say this lack of sufficient appropriate evidence is material and pervasive. If it were, for example, a balance that was 20% of profit, it would be just material. Finally, the wording of the opinion. In this situation, due to the size of the balances where evidence is missing, the auditors cannot form an opinion. They would therefore issue a disclaimer stating an opinion could not be formed. Above the opinion section of the audit report would be a basis for disclaimer section explaining the situation and why the opinion cannot be formed. And so to summarize Daisy, there is a lack of evidence for revenue and receivables. It is very material, being 8 times bigger and 170% of profit. They should discuss other evidence with the client and perform analytical procedures. The audit report would be modified due to a lack of sufficient appropriate evidence, as it is a material and pervasive issue. A disclaimer is issued and a basis for disclaimer to explain. Finally, let's look at future enterprises. Here we have a client who has had trading problems. In detail, we see they need more funding as they've made a loss and their cash flow forecasts look very concerning. For part 1, the issue is that the financial statements have been prepared on the going concern basis, with no additional disclosure to inform the users of the current financial difficulties. To consider the size of the problem, the net cash outflow given in the cash flow forecast is 73% of the net loss shown in the financial statements. This again is a very material issue. For part 2, the audit procedures to perform could include discussions with the directors of their plans to obtain funding and how otherwise they're going to reduce the net cash outflow. The auditor should also inspect any correspondence from the bank and also review board minutes to identify plans and if there's been any further evidence on obtaining finance. For part 3, we once again turn to the audit report. If not resolved and the financial statements are not amended, then the auditors disagree with the contents and will need to state the financial statements are not true and fair. This will mean the audit report will be modified with a qualified opinion due to material misstatements in the financial statements. The size of the net cash outflow in comparison to the loss is very material at 73%. If there is not disclosure on the going concern issues, then this is very misleading to the users of the financial statements. We would therefore say the issue is material and pervasive. The opinion in this situation is called an adverse opinion. Basically, this states that the financial statements are not true and fair. A basis of opinion paragraph will be above the opinion, explaining the auditor's findings and their reservations regarding the client's going concern status. And so, summarizing future. there are concerns they may struggle to continue trading, and disclosure in the financial statements is inadequate. It is very material as potentially misleading the users, and net cash outflow is 73% of net loss. Auditors should discuss with the client and review bank correspondence and board minutes. The audit report will be modified with a qualified opinion due to the material misstatement. It is material and pervasive, and an adverse opinion is issued with the basis for opinion paragraph. A review of the suggested answer on the ACCA website is recommended. There were other procedures you could have mentioned, however it is important to stick to the requirements and the marking allocation. In summary, each requirement needs to be answered within the time allocation to give yourself the best chance to complete all the questions. Careful planning of the structure of your answer is needed. Include clear headings to introduce your answer. Reference your answer to the part of the question you are answering, and leave spaces between each part to make it easier for the marker to allocate marks. Finally, wherever possible, use the scenario. This information has been given to you for a reason, and at F8 they are testing whether you can apply your knowledge to a new situation, and not just whether you can remember the facts from your studies. Thank you for listening and good luck.